Okay. Um, so I was hoping everyone could bring questions, because I feel like with this topic, there's so much misinformation going around that I tend to spend a lot of time just answering people's questions on things. But I can start by just kind of giving like a basic overview of what this virus is, what we know about it, what we don't know about it, just to get the basic things kind of over and done with, and then I can start taking questions. But I'll try to keep it brief. So basically, what avian influenza is it's a subcategory of the influenza type A virus. The reason why it's important to know that it's a type A influenza virus is because this virus, this subcategory of virus, is known to be able to do a lot of genetic reassortment. So this is a phenomenon that happens when one influenza virus meets another strain of influenza virus in the same animal or organism. And they're able to swap genetics, which results in mutations and genetic reassortment. And that's always been the reason why there's a big risk factor associated with any type of bird flu. That being said, there are so many types of bird flu that have already happened um, in the past. So when you're looking at different types of avian influenzas, type A influenzas, you also need to realize that they're all broken down into H proteins and N proteins. So you have influenza viruses, avian influenza type A viruses, and then H types and N types. And in the H category, there's 16 different known H proteins. And in the N category, there's 9 different N proteins. So that we already know of, there's 16 times 9 or whatever that math is. I'm not going to do it. We've seen that many H something N somethings. The other thing to think about with this virus is you can even subcategorize it further into low pathogenic avian influenza and highly pathogenic avian influenza. So you have avian influenzas as a whole family, as a group that we know are low pathogenic, meaning they're very much in the environment. They've existed for a long time. They don't cause a whole lot of morbidity and mortality, meaning sickness and death. And then you have your highly pathogenic avian influenzas, which is a whole family of different types of bird flus that are known to cause a lot of mortality and a lot of morbidity. So for decades and decades, we've had a lot of low path in wild bird species and even in domestic bird species, and it hasn't necessarily been a big deal. The concern is when we get a new strain of high path, because of that ability to kind of like cross into the same bird, which that bird likely has seen or lived through some low path strains, that's the moment, that's the potential for that viral reassortment. So that is what we worry about. Because we know many strains of avian influenza are basically ubiquitous. So the fact that they already exist in a goose or a turkey makes it concerning for the day that that high path avian influenza crosses paths with that low path strain. Now, when you factor in the idea that we've had a highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in 2022, which is not that long ago, there's still probably some of that. I think that was H5N8. We're currently dealing with H5N1. There's still probably some H5N8 out there in this reservoir of wild bird species and not actually totally gone yet. We think and hope that we eradicated it, but we don't know. So the potential for 2022's H5N8 and 2024's H5N1 and whatever low path is going on to all cross paths and reassort presents a huge risk for mutation. So that is really what we worry about. So that being said, H5N1 touched down and was first identified in Texas in March 2024. So it's been about a year. And it's had an interesting trajectory. It has been a little bit different than the high path avian influenzas that we've seen in the past. Specifically, the two ways that I can think of is the mortality rate's a little bit higher. So most strains of HPAI or highly pathogenic avian influenza have like a 90-ish, maybe 93% mortality rate. This is kind of more of a 98% mortality rate in chickens. So it's much higher than what we've seen in the past. The other thing that is kind of different about this is it's much more driven by fomite transfer than other strains we've seen. And by that, what I'm referring to is an inanimate object causing the spread of the virus. So viruses can be spread in many ways, right? Coughing and putting out aerosol droplets, vomiting and diarrhea, spreading viruses. And you can also have what's called fomite transmission, where it's, you touch something or part of your person touches something, and then you walk into a different room and you basically walk that virus into a different room. So previously, high path avian influenza was more respiratory, it was more fecal oral, but with H5N1, we're seeing it spread mostly on vehicles and on people's footwear. So almost all the spread that has happened because a truck went from one farm to the other, which, I mean, if you're a farmer, like trucks are always going from one farm to the other, or via footwear. So, cleaning up after your coop, getting in your car, going to Tractor Supply, walking through the store, going back home to your coop. So those are the main differences that are pretty concerning right now. For the longest time, it was kind of like staying in the West, but it has officially hit New England, and that's kind of where we're at right now. But that is like the very high level overview of, how avian influenza generically acts, and also what is a little bit different about this one. So that all being said, if anyone wants to jump in and ask me something about it or something they read, feel free.
What are the symptoms in our flocks? How do we know if we've got it?
Yeah. So in chickens, so the answer is different in chickens versus waterfowl, so geese and ducks. In chickens, if you catch it, if you're being very, very observant, you may notice decreased water consumption, which I feel like is kind of silly because it's like, good luck, right? It's kind of a hard symptom to catch, or a slight decrease in egg production. But if you have a chance to notice those things, you're probably seeing your first mortality in about 8 to 12 hours after that point. So you don't have a whole lot of time to notice symptoms. In this strain specifically, they're not getting the respiratory signs that they've gotten in other avian influenzas. So with other avian influenzas, you would have seen, gasping, wheezing, coughing, struggling to breathe. In this situation, it's happening so quickly that those respiratory signs aren't even happening. So basically the rule of thumb for regulatory agents right now is that don't be out on the lookout for symptoms, rather be on the lookout for a sudden mortality. And if you have more than 2 or maybe 3 over like a 24-hour to 36-hour window, that is your trigger point to call someone about it and to have avian influenza on your suspicion list.
Who do we call?
So that depends on what state you're in. So you'll have 2 ways that you can report. You can report it to the state, you can report it federally. So you can call your Department of Agriculture specific to your state, and report it to them, or you can report it to the USDA. And the way that you would find out which USDA person to report it to, I'm going to put it in the chat right now, is you're just going to Google USDA APHIS regional VMO, which is a veterinary medical officer. So you'll go to, you'll get redirected to basically a spreadsheet where It'll be all the different USDA officers for your region, and you just find one of the numbers that works and you call it. Now you could also, if you have a private vet, a poultry vet, that you use, you can also report it to them and they can just take it from there. So go whatever direction that they want to go in. But this is technically going to be reportable via both. So it doesn't matter which one you pick. You can report it to your state. They're going to call the USDA anyway. You can recall the USDA. They're going to call your state department anyway. So whoever it is you choose to call first, they're all going to call each other right away anyways.
Thank you. What
Yeah.
are they going to do after we call them?
So usually the first thing that happens is they try to send somebody out within 24 hours to swab the birds that are alive. Or sometimes they'll swab the dead ones. So if you held on to those, they can test those ones. What the swab is it's this like testing reagent that's sort of like a broth. And they swab the roof of their mouth and then they send it to the lab. It goes to a state lab first and then a federal lab second. So that's another important thing to know about how this works. So the state labs, depending on what state you're in, they can only give you a binary answer, right? So they can say, yes, it's high path avian influenza, or no, it's not high path avian influenza. What they can't do is tell you what strain it is. So what happens is it goes to your state lab. Let's say it's positive. You'll know about 36, 48 hours later, it's positive. And then that sample flies to Iowa. And about 24, 36 hours later, Iowa says, yes, it's positive, and the HN strain is da 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 da. H5N7, H5N8, H5N1. So that's the first thing that happens. The reason why I'm taking time to explain what the primary test and the confirmatory test is because I saw some news coverage coming from Martha's Vineyard specifically regarding the turkeys, where I guess like one of the outlets announced that it was positive for a high path avian influenza, but they didn't specify what strain it was. So it seemed like it caused a lot of stress in the community because they knew it was positive, but they didn't know if it was H5N1 or not H5N1. So I wanted to make sure I explained that, because if you're coming at this from the journalist perspective and you're going to report on it, you may just want to wait like the extra 24 hours until you get the true confirmation of what strain it is. Otherwise, it ends up being like kind of vague, but also inflammatory. So it really, really stresses people out. So let's say there's kind of a divergent point in activity from that first test. So let's say your state reports back to you, yes, it was positive. After that, the response is going to be very state dependent. Some states will come out based on just that answer and do what they're going to do next, which I'll talk about in a second. Some states will wait for the confirmation to come back. So, for example, some states will say that any high path avian influenza is grounds for them to euthanize the flock. Some states say, we don't believe that's necessary. We wouldn't euthanize for, let's say, H5N7, but we would euthanize for H5N1. So they'll wait. So that's a little bit of a like divergence point there. So I wouldn't want to speak on how your state would act when they get that first test result. But if it turns out that the confirmatory test comes back and it's H5N1, the choice is going to be to euthanize the flock. And that's something in which, typically speaking, the regulatory body that you're dealing with, they're going to have some level of authority to do that. And the reasons why they make that choice, a lot of it has to do with, first of all, the mortality rate. So it's a welfare issue. They want to stop birds from struggling and dying that way. because they know that 97, 98% of them are going to go anyways. So it's almost like a service to be done. But more importantly, a lot of that is to eliminate the possibility of mutations jumping out from that flock. And everyone's place is a lot different, right? So your chickens might be interfacing with wild ducks, your chickens might be interfacing with swine, they might be interfacing with dairy, they might be interfacing with an immunocompromised human that takes care of them. So in all of those scenarios, you have a big threat of viral mutation. So that's one of the reasons why the choice is to eliminate the flock. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna look at the chat here. So we have some questions. Let me see. Is it dumb luck that it hasn't shown up in industrial scale pig farms yet? Yeah, I would say that is probably purely dumb luck. I would say that it's probably a matter of time. I hope it's not immediately imminent. But yeah, so far. Are there any special measures being taken to keep that from happening? Yeah, so a big part of the outreach right now is to communicate with pig farmers about not only just general biosecurity, right, but this concept of if you're going to feed dairy products to pigs, pasteurizing milk first. At least in my neck of the woods, I see a pretty common practice of waste dairy product being fed out to growing pigs, which I personally don't think there's anything wrong with. I think it's a really nice way to get rid of a byproduct and not have it become waste. But because we know that H5N1 can be transmitted across species in raw milk, we're just encouraging people to just pasteurize it before they feed it out to pigs. But the commercial swine industry is very biosecurity minded, so hopefully a lot of that is kind of headed off before it starts. Okay. How is it generally transmitted to other livestock? Direct exposure to sick birds, contamination from shoes, equipment, assuming fomite transmission. Yeah, so it comes onto the premises almost always by fomite or interface with wild birds. So it's going to come onto the property. Either someone's going to walk it on, drive it on, or a bird is going to bring it in. From that point on, once it's on the farm, it's more, I think, fecal oral than it is aerosol spread, so respiratory. So in the dairy farms, I believe a lot of it is transmitted from birds flying through the barn and shedding droppings out on the silage or whatever. So after it arrives on the property via fomite, then it transmits to other species, usually via more like traditional routes that we typically see avian influenza acting in. And like I said, that ingestion of raw milk across species is also a real player in this game too. And that's actually how this was first identified in the very beginning, is from barn cats. The theory is barn cats ingesting raw milk or eating birds that were dropping dead raw. Okay, in which wild bird species, especially big migratory flocks other than seabirds, is it most widespread? The waterfowl. So ducks and geese are the real bad guy in the story, unfortunately, which stinks because they're so cute. But waterfowl are known to have some special thing about them where they have a much less instance of mortality and morbidity from any of the bird flus that we've seen in the past. So effectively what they're doing is carrying it around and not getting obviously sick from it immediately or dying from it immediately. So because of that, they're spreading it all over the place. Okay. Who else has a question for me?
What protections, what concerns do humans have to have if we interact with a flock that has the flu?
Yeah. So there have been human cases from this. I honestly lost count last month, but I think we were up to maybe the high 60s or the low 70s of human cases. Um, they're almost all attributed to occupational risk and then poultry. So it's overrepresented that the human patients are involved in poultry industry or some way. And then after that, dairy farmers would also have occupational risk. There was only one mortality so far. So all of the cases that we've seen in humans so far have been pretty mild and self-resolving, except for that one. We did have one mortality, and that person had really heightened occupational risk. They were working with commercial poultry, but then also handling wild waterfowl at different parts of the day. And I think that there were comorbidities too. So I think this was also an immunocompromised person. And unfortunately, in that case, it was determined that the virus went through 3 different mutation cycles before that man passed away. So in that instance, there were 3 mutations. So in terms of protecting yourself, I think it very much depends on your exposure risk. I think if you're directly handling poultry and you have some degree of immunocompromise, you should probably wear appropriate PPE or personal protective equipment. Um, if you don't have that occupational risk, I think it's a lot lower, but I would still be very careful about the personal time spent with chickens. So say you're not working with commercial poultry, but you have a backyard flock and you're a healthy person. I think your risks of getting avian influenza from your flock, if your flock was to get it, are pretty low, but they're definitely not zero. So if you have a mortality in a small backyard flock, I would probably start using PPE at that point. Um, However, before PPE, there's other things that you can do to protect yourself. So removing bird feeders and bird baths from the backyard, changing footwear from outdoor to indoor, things like that can be really helpful. All right, recommendations for small flock owners to help reduce exposure. Is it best to keep birds in a run, enclosed tractor, etc.? I think the biggest thing would be to keep waterfowl away from your property. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be in an enclosed run or a chicken tractor, but if there's something you can do to secure the perimeter of your property from ducks and geese coming in, then that would be best. And I feel like a lot of times those cases are dependent on like nearby waterways. So where I've seen the most high path avian influenza, there's always like a pond or a creek in the backyard or in the wildlife easement right behind the property, for example. So dissuading waterfowl from coming onto your property is really important. I also think thinking really critically about your movements through the community and where you might be crossing paths with other poultry owners is also pretty important. So this is yet another one of those times where I try to discourage people from doing a lot of trading and bird swapping for sure. But also think about the times when you go to the feed store or the times when you might be going over to a different farm to work there or something like that. And what you're doing to like disinfect yourself and your vehicle on the way back to your property. Is it possible to salvage the rest of the flock after an HPAI mortality? I would say no. So like I said, I think this kind of depends on state to state, but most states have the stance that they are going to eliminate the flock once that H5N1 diagnosis is made. So, theoretically, with a 98% mortality rate, maybe you have 2% of your birds survive that. But then those 2% of those birds have H5N1, and they then are the exact creature that we were concerned about swapping that into the wildlife population, and then a genetic ressortment happens, and then we have a more explosive pandemic on our hands. So I would say it's not possible. Now, I have heard that there is a state not anywhere around the Northeast that is tinkering with the idea of allowing survivors to live on in a closed flock. But unless you're in that state specifically, I don't think that you have, unfortunately, much of an argument to make, because once this is identified as highly pathogenic avian influenza, regulatory bodies have the authority that they need to make those decisions. So there's also a lot of reasons why you shouldn't let survivors continue to live, but that's a much longer answer. And if we want to, I can get into that a little bit later. I just want to give other people a chance to ask some more questions before I really go off on a tangent. Is there a product you recommend for boot disinfectant? Yes. I love, I'm typing it into the chat, Virkon S. So this is what the EPA and the USDA recommend for disinfection for avian influenza viruses. In times like this, sometimes it goes on back order. So you just kind of have to buy it when you can get it. But I get it in like a huge tub and it's a powder, and then you dilute it out. And what I do is I make a garden sprayer like you would use for a weed killer, and then a little spray bottle for cleaner. And I keep both of those on my truck. And I use the little spray bottle to do my shoes, and I use the pump sprayer for my tires and the undercarriage of my car. Are wild turkeys a threat? Yes. So turkeys are not waterfowl, they're gallinaceous birds, which means they're more related to chickens. But yes, they're definitely still a transmission threat for sure. All right. Any other questions? I feel like I hear somebody's microphone.
How easy is it for a dog or a cat to get infected?
Yeah, good question. So in cats, the transmission, or the vulnerability, I should say, is higher than in dogs. So we're seeing cases in both cats and dogs, but it's quite a bit different how it plays out. So cats seem to get this more often, or they have a higher sensitivity to getting it than dogs do. But they also suffer a whole lot more. So the rate of illness is higher and the rate of death is higher in cats than it is in dogs. When this was first identified a year ago, it was the death of the cats in the dairy facility that tipped people off. So cats can absolutely get this. The real risk of them getting it is from hunting type activities. So going outside, eating, killing and eating raw birds, or ingesting raw milk is another big way that cats are getting this. And then when they do get the virus, about 60 to 70% of the time, they do get really sick from it. And I don't know what the mortality rate is, but well, I don't know right now what the mortality rate is, but a couple months ago, I think it was about 50 to 60%. The clinical signs can be a really wide range of symptoms. So it could be lethargy, inappetence, drowsiness, or it could be true neurological symptoms. So partial or general seizures, hyperactivity, overreactivity to stimuli, things like that. And it progresses pretty fast. So after they get the virus, it's a couple days of clinical signs, milder clinical signs before they go into like a severe clinical sign state. Now, luckily, it seems to be much more treatable for them than it is in poultry. So a lot of cats are surviving it. And then on the canine side, the incidence is so low that there's not really much data yet. We know that they're getting it, but they don't seem to get very sick from it. And the mortality rate is really, really low. I don't know exactly what the number is, so I don't want to say it, but it seems to be quite low. Do rats play a role in transmission? Definitely. So not only have rats tested positive in screens for this, specifically in the West. So I think it was New Mexico was the first state to report rats testing positive for H5N1. But they can also be a fomite. So rats are part of the culprit of, and other rodents too, honestly, mice, raccoons, mink, stuff like that, tracking it through facility. So rodent control, and I'm glad you asked for this point, rodent control is also a really important way to keep this off your premises. Yeah. How long do you need to wait to get more chickens after your flock is tested positive? So that is definitely a state-specific answer. Every state has a different rule that they go with on that. In Connecticut, and I believe in Massachusetts, I think it's 120 days that you have to have no birds on the property before you're allowed to repopulate. So I have to say the way that I feel about that particular landmark is I don't think that a whole lot of data went into that decision. I think that decision was more of a precedent thing. So that the 120-day rule was implemented because of other diseases. And I think because there was a precedent for that being the rule, kind of that's where states have jumped off and picked that rather than relying on the more epidemiological data. So personally, I don't love the 120-day rule, but if you're asking from Massachusetts or Connecticut, that's the rule. Let's see. This might be state dependent. In New Jersey, they say you should report the loss of more than one bird in 24 hours. Is there any type of recall or discard that needs to be done with the eggs? Cooked eggs should be safe. But as a small producer, not sure. Yeah, so if you are cooking eggs to 165 degrees or higher, you are killing any viral particles that are in that egg. So as long as you're cooking them that way, it's safe to consume, even if that bird just literally died from H5N1 a couple hours ago. For recall or discard, there's no agency that's willing to put out a rule of thumb on that yet. I think the FDA is kind of like circling coming out with an answer on that soon, but haven't actually gotten one. Most places on the commercial side, so what I'm saying is any eggs that you buy in a grocery store, there would be a recall of a couple of days from within that facility. So you would never even get those eggs on the shelf. For a small producer, I mean, if I had to make up a recall myself, instead of waiting for somebody to come out with one, I would say 2 days is more than sufficient. They're unlikely to lay an egg the day that they die from H5N1, and they're unlikely to lay an egg the day before they die from H5N1. 120 days seems extreme. I disagree. I actually think it should be longer. If you were faced with euthanasia of your flock, is there an advised protocol? This is a great question. Maybe you shouldn't be doing this as the state would be involved. Yes, absolutely. So if your flock needs to be euthanized, your state comes and does that for you. You don't need to go find somebody to do it. You don't have to pay for it. So the state comes, does it for you, and they pay for it. So you don't have to pay anything for it. And if for some reason you're in an area where you don't have good state coverage and the USDA takes hold of the case, it'll be the same thing. So they'll come out and do euthanasia for you. They'll do all the disposal for you and you won't pay for it at all. Can you talk about the difference in control measures between backyard and commercial flocks? Yeah, so commercial flocks are like high security prisons, right? I don't know if anyone's ever gone out to like a big commercial facility in here, but typically there's multiple lines of separation on the property behind like security people, and then each housing unit is its own contained facility that has its own isolated ventilation system, waste system, feeding water system, equipment, and personnel. And people will shower in and out and put on facility clothing. when they go into that building and then leave in their street clothes. So in terms of biosecurity in a commercial setting, things are usually run so tight and everything is so documented, that if there's a problem, usually within a couple of minutes, that facility can look at their documentation and figure out how that breach happened and what they should do to respond. Backyard flocks are probably the most stressful thing to consider when you're working in a regulatory body, whether you're state or federal. The second that the high path hits the area, we're not concerned about, well, economically, we're concerned about commercial facilities, but epidemiologically, we worry the most about the backyard flocks because this will be like your guy that's got 6 hens in the backyard, but he loves to like walk down to the creek and feed the wild geese, you know? Or this will be like the person that's got a couple of pigs and, you know, one family milk cow and the herd of chickens, and they're just walking from spot to spot on the farm. And then you have the community aspect of all of that too. So you have people that are going to come, you know, from one house to the other and have a cocktail in the backyard and watch the chickens play and then go home to their own chickens. So we worry most about the backyard flocks. The commercial flocks have everything so dialed in, that yes, it's an economic hit, but they're very prepared, to react to this type of thing from a biosecurity standpoint. I hope that's the answer to your question. I'm not sure if I took that in the direction you were thinking of, so just let me know if I'm off. Barn swallows are unlikely to cause the virus. Is this true? All wild birds can carry the virus. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get sick and die from it, but I can verify this in like 2 seconds. So USDA APHIS has an interactive, talking and typing at the same time, has an interactive map on their website where you can go look at your region and see what all the wild bird detections have been and what species of bird that they're in. So that might be a good way to verify. Yeah, so it breaks it down into species. So it'll tell you the state, the county, the day that it tested positive, which strain it tested positive for, how it was classified, so wild, domestic, and then what species. So I'll share that in here. Okay, so it looks like the website's about 7 days behind, which is not too bad. I'll put that in the chat. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, how long, do you have any kind of feel for how long this is going to run its course?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when this all started about a year ago, I was pretty hopeful that it was just going to kind of sweep through and then sweep back out. It was just moving so fast. And then once it was leaving the states that it was in, the states were clearing the virus and announcing themselves free of the virus really quickly. So I kind of hoped like this time last year that it was going to be kind of here and gone in under a year. But it stopped acting like that probably like September or October of last year. And where it really stalled out was in Ohio. So Ohio had their first case, and then it spread really quickly. They got it under control. They almost cleared the state twice, and then it whipped back through the state again. And so for me, what that tells me is there's some kind of mutations going on in Ohio. Because up until then, this states were clearing this with no problem. I was talking to other public health agents in other states, and they were saying like, yeah, I can't believe it. Like everyone's completely clear, completely negative. It's totally gone. And something's going on in Ohio where it just keeps cycling back through, which is not good. I mean, when it lingers in places, that's when you see mutations. So I was really optimistic about all this until like September, October, and then I got a lot less optimistic. If you had to gauge it on avian influenzas of the past, The H5N8 in 2022 is still around. So it's been 3 years, but it has become much less pathogenic. So it's really kind of like piddled out. Before that, the last outbreak I saw was in 2016, and that went very much like this one was going in the beginning. It just decimated everything in like months and then was just gone. So I don't know what I would predict. I think now that it's actually here in my region and I've been waiting a year for it to get here, when I start looking at the data coming in from the wild bird populations and talking to my producers and seeing like how it's acting here, I'll probably have a better guess. But I feel like we'll at least be dealing with this for another 9 to 12 months minimum. Yeah. Um, all right. Any other questions? Okay, I do have something to bring up. So I heard that in my state right now, which is Connecticut, um, that there's a lot of, I don't know how to put this. There is a test being sold over the counter for high path avian influenza. And it looks a lot like a COVID test. It's just like this little plastic container with a strip in the middle. Um, and people are going around in my state and testing birds, not symptomatic birds, so birds that are not sick, using this test. And then it seems to be that there's a really high positive rate, so it's causing a lot of people to panic, and or interpret incorrectly. So not only are people like selling this test where again I don't even know where it came from, but people are going around that are not veterinarians, or not state or federally affiliated, and they're offering like this service of testing for it with this test that seems to be like it came out of a warehouse 15 years ago or something. Like I have no idea where this came from, but a lot of people are testing positive that have perfectly healthy flocks, so we hate that because it causes a lot of panic, right? But the other thing that's happening is people are getting this positive result and then their birds are alive a week later. And so they're like, see, this isn't that bad. My birds are just fine. They lived through it and they're not having a problem. And this whole thing is just a big scam and a big conspiracy. So I definitely wanted to make sure that I brought that up because I'm hearing a lot about that. So if someone is selling truck side or like come to your house tests and it's not the the real official test that we use to make decisions, then don't fall into the trap, I guess. Bryce, did I hit any of the questions you sent me? I'm trying to find your email now.
I think you got most of them. I'll double check.
Yeah, I just found, okay. Bird feeders, songbirds. Oh, okay. So which birds necessitate testing and which can be disposed of? If your birds are healthy and you're not seeing symptoms, then there's no need to test for it. There are so many other diseases in birds that cause severe respiratory signs. So just because it's going around right now and it's all over the news, if your birds start coughing and wheezing, does not mean that this is the most likely diagnosis. I can think of 6, maybe 8 other things that are more likely. Plus, if you remember to what I said back in the very beginning, you don't typically see any clinical signs with this at all. You just see the mortalities. So the trigger point for testing should be multiple mortalities. So here in this area, it's like 2-3 mortalities over 24 or 36 hours should be the point in which you reach out and you try to get testing. It sounds like Lauren is saying in New Jersey, did you say more than 1 in 24 hours? Yeah, more than 1 bird in 24 hours. So I would just say in general, more than one over a day and a half, you should be with no clinical signs is when you should pursue testing. If you have sudden onset respiratory symptoms and you have a private practitioner that sees poultry, I would call them and talk to them about it. If you don't, you could always reach out to your state's Department of Ag and see if they have a poultry inspector or a poultry vet on staff that can talk you through what the other scenarios would be. If you have mortalities, this is another good one. And you want to save it for testing purposes. You always want to refrigerate, never freeze, and you want to double bag. So put on gloves, double bag it, put it in the fridge, and don't freeze it. Put that in the chat. Okay.
Aaron, can you talk about bird feeders?
Yeah. So the issue of removing bird feeders and bird baths from the backyard. I was not encouraging people to do this until I first started hearing of the first wildlife mortalities in my region. But now that, it's here and the wildlife have it and we have domestic birds with it, I definitely think it's an easy, practical, free, cheap way to help prevent transmission onto your property. So what I've been telling people to do is just, bag it all and put it in the garage until all of this kind of blows over. Reason being, of course, it attracts wild birds to the property. And even if you don't have backyard chickens, it's still a smart thing to do because it kind of pulls your radius of tracking it into your house kind of closer to you. And if you have dogs or cats, then you have a transmission risk there as well for your pets. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Alrighty. Anybody else have any other bird flu questions? No. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to make sure that I talked about is there's this theory going around on the internet that I'm seeing a lot, multiple times a day, every day, that what we really should be doing is allowing some birds to survive this so that they can build a natural immunity, and then create, like a stronger, more viable or more virulent, no, antivirulent, a stronger chicken, basically. So, to be honest with you, I think it's a great idea in theory, but the place that this is coming from, I think it's one of those situations where it's like they know just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be correct. So to me, this sounds like a really valid argument at first brush, but there's multiple reasons why the natural immunity concept doesn't really actually pan out this way. So if you think about kind of everything we went over about the basic virology of this, a lot of the problem is that subclinical infection reservoir is the term we use for it. So the waterfowl, for example, I keep bringing up the fact that the ducks and the geese kind of walk around with this and spread it all over the place because they have it, but they're not dead from it, which means that they're highly infective. So the same thing theoretically would occur with your surviving chicken. Then your surviving chicken would just be this reservoir of pathogen, but not a normal pathogen. It would be a reservoir of a pathogen that has a huge adaptive evolutionary push to mutate as soon as possible. So that creature is walking around shedding a very high infective virus load. In an environment where clearly other things were at play too. Therefore, the ability to cross-contaminate with another virus already exists. The other thing is just the welfare component of it all. So in flocks that are affected, they just start dying in droves. And the ones that don't die immediately, they will go on to develop the severe respiratory symptoms and they'll die gasping for breath. It just takes them a couple days to do it. So from a welfare perspective, to kind of like give these birds a decent and humane death, and not one where they're watching all of these birds just dropping dead in mass numbers and or suffocating to death. It's a welfare, psychological, humane handling issue. The other thing is that one state that is choosing to kind of like play with this. What they're seeing is that when they follow up on these surviving birds, the natural immunity that they hoped would happen is not getting installed. So they're retesting these birds and the birds in the environment, and they're finding that not only are these birds really sick, like really sickly and poor doing and like barely clinging on to life, but they have spread it everywhere, and it's mutating. So that's another issue. The other reason why this is not a great idea is because the small handful of birds that have survived high-path avian influenza have been so severely compromised that they're incapable of any sort of reproduction. So they're not laying, they're developing reproductive cancers, and they're kind of just wasting away. So they're not living good quality lives. There's other reasons too, right? So the other issue is a trade and economics issue. So we have trading partners to answer to. We have a great poultry industry in the United States, and our stakeholders are concerned with our ability to control pathogens. So we risk a lot of good economic viability if we do not control an avian influenza situation. This also has implications for our own food supply, obviously. So I could go down that route, but that's a whole other tangent. And then kind of lastly, my own personal opinion on this is we've had high-path avian influenza for decades. If natural immunity was going to work, why isn't it working? So we have had birds survive here and there from this. So if that was going to be the theory that worked, we should have seen the dividends by now, and we haven't. In fact, every new bird flu seems to have a higher mortality than the last one. So that's not the way that this is behaving. And there's other diseases in history that we should have learned this lesson from. Measles is one of them, smallpox is one of them, polio is one of them. These are all times in history when we all said, is there a chance we could develop natural immunity? And we learned, no, there's not. So those are all the reasons why that's not a great idea. I don't knock anyone for believing that theory for a moment though, just because in other diseases with other situations, I would tend to agree with that sentiment. But I wanted to make sure I took time to address that particular issue. And I think one of the reasons why this theory is gathering so much steam on the internet, is because you can't deflate that theory in like less than 60 seconds. There's so many different reasons why it doesn't work, and every single one of those reasons requires a certain amount of like context. So it doesn't make like a good TikTok or a good short comment on Facebook. There's really no way to put that answer in like a nice bite-sized way. No one has the patience to sit through all of that explanation except for you guys. So I think that's one of the reasons that this theory is spreading, because it's hard to really argue against it. It takes time and it takes a lot of context. You could have a chronic shedder and it could survive. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's it in a nutshell, all right. Other H5N1 questions. Does anyone have any like personal H5N1 questions? like something they're worrying about with their own personal situation.
Yes, we live on the water. Actually, Martha's Vineyard, virtually every community is exposed to waterfowl, and my concern is they're just we have more geese on our property, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
And they defecate all over the place, and I'm wondering, first of all, the fomite transmission, does that I'm assuming that includes feces.
Yes.
So so then the question is, do you see a prevalent population of sick birds on this island?
So I was just there in February and things were kind of just heating up in the wild bird population, but things hadn't quite broken through to the domestic bird population yet. So when I was there in February, I was definitely seeing and hearing of a lot of instances of H5N1 in wild birds. So you guys had that case with the turkeys, right? And when I was there, I was seeing a lot of dead wild birds. So for example, because when I'm there, I go on farm calls. For example, I would, be in my truck, walk to the barn, go see the cow, walk back to my truck to grab medicine, and trip and fall over a dead bird that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. So I was seeing and hearing of and getting data of a lot of wild bird cases. And it was like maybe a week after I left, you guys had your first backyard flock case. So it's definitely on the island. And I think that because of how coastal you are and you're right in that bird migration pattern, I really think that now that it's there, it's probably just going to get hammered in. So my hope would be that it again sweeps in and out and it doesn't linger. The real indicator will be what the summer months bring. So probably the next couple months are going to be a high incidence of H5N1 cases on the island. And then hopefully by the time you guys hit June or July, things should slow down. In the fall, when migration starts again, if you guys don't have a recurrence of virus, then that'll be the best news that you could get.
Is there any concern with our grandkids running all over the property and getting goose droppings in their shoes and bringing it to the house, and as far as transmitting it to humans?
Yeah, that would be something that you want to try to mitigate. Do you have backyard chickens?
We do. We have two, but we're keeping them in the coop.
Okay. And do you have cats?
No.
Okay. So yeah, I think the grandkids running around, running through droppings, in and out of the yard and up to the house and stuff. If your chickens are affected by H5N1, that's the way that they'll get it. To me, that's a pretty clear line. And then in terms of, possibly affecting the humans, I don't know how old they are, but I have little kids and I can't keep anything out of their mouths. So I definitely understand that struggle, but I honestly would consider just carrying some kind of wipe, even if it's a baby wipe, that's not necessarily like a good decontamination type of wipe. And just making sure you're wiping hands and shoes. And maybe you have to institute like a no shoes past the threshold of the house rule. And just hit him with a hose and some bleach or some sort of Lysol spray or that Vircon product that I mentioned. Just because like, again, I know how little kids are and they run around outside and then, they come in and they're like, they want a snack and they want a drink. And then they're like wiping their mouth and their nostrils with the hand that was just like in the goose poop. So I would definitely increase your efforts to keep the hands clean and the shoes clean. Yeah, so Leah said, while there hasn't been any human cases known to be infected from goose poop, of the 70 human cases in the US, a better safe than sorry approach is never a bad idea. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it can happen. The risk is not zero. So, yeah. Okay. I did. So, the boot wash. Yeah, I did. But it seems like for some reason I only sent it to one person instead of everyone. So I'm gonna go back and just make sure all my messages went out the right way. Okay. So the first thing that I put in the chat was the term that you would have to look up to find your regionally appointed USDA person. So again, that is the USDA APHIS regional VMO. If you look for that, you'll get a spreadsheet populated that will tell you who to call for the USDA in your area. And that's one of your options for reporting multiple chicken mortalities. The virucidal product that I like to use is Virkon S. Are you guys seeing this now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Virkon is the product that I mix it up with just tap water and I do a spray bottle and then I do like a pump sprayer. It's a good product and it smells nice, which when you're dealing with terrible smells all day, that matters. Okay, so then we're gonna do this link. So I'll also put this link in the chat. So this will bring you to an interactive chart. And you can look up all the detections that are happening and in what species of wild bird and what strain of hypath it was, what state, what county, so on and so forth. And then the last thing that I put in there was if you have dead chickens and you want to save them for testing, refrigerate them, do not freeze them. Any safety precautions for little 4-Hers showing in fairs this year? I honestly, I think it depends on the ventilation of the fair or the show that you're going to be in. I personally would not want little kids in like a very packed, tight poultry barn. Just because I can see that being like a high pathogen situation. So I would just make sure there's really good ventilation in the barn. Again, I would be wiping hands. I would be disinfecting shoes. I would be talking to them about washing their hands before they eat stuff, things like that. And just to say for anyone that doesn't know me outside of this, it is unusual for me to recommend stuff like that. I'm a very like hygiene theory type of mom. My kids are always filthy and I think it's a good thing. But when it comes to high path avian influenza, just because of what I've seen, I tend to be a lot more cautious. Bryce said report birds to Department of Agriculture. There we go. Nice. So for Massachusetts to report to MDAR, there are the links right there. Yeah, nice. Okay, any other questions that people have about their own personal situation? If not, I can cover the issue of rabies vaccinating goats. I know it's a bit of a leap from bird flu, but it is something that I see people talking about all the time. And it's another like weird situation in which there's a bunch of caveats. But before I jump into that, I'll give it a minute or two in case anyone has any other bird flu questions for me. Will the high heat of a dryer kill the possible virus? Yeah, so I mean, in a lot of different scenarios, these what if scenarios, we are seeing that heat tends to kill it. So that's kind of why the FDA has come out with this really strong messaging about cooking the eggs to 165, pasteurizing milk, cooking beef too. Listen, they say 165. I personally don't eat steak at 165, but that's what they're saying. So I do think heat application is probably really important. No one has come out yet with a study that proves it though, and we also know historically high path avian influenza tends to go away in the summertime in the heat anyway. So there's some really strong anecdotal indications that heat kills it, but no one's ever said officially in a statement. Similarly, there's also a lot of talk right now of acidity killing the virus. So one of the things that the state agencies were fiddling around with last summer was instead of having people pasteurize milk products, having them heavily dilute raw milk products in a large amount of very acidic solution. It never was something that came to fruition because the amount of solution you would need in the ratio to the milk was so high that it's just easier to pasteurize. So, but that's besides the point. Okay. All right. So the issue of vaccinating goats for rabies. So for those of you that don't know where this topic is coming from, a lot of people, a lot of goat owners deliberate back and forth over whether it's worth it to vaccinate their goats for rabies. And a lot of them are confused as to why or why not. The reason this confusion exists is because there is one rabies vaccine for farm animal species on the market. And it's labeled for basically everything but goats. So it's labeled for sheep, horses, cows, I think even swine, but not goats. So because of this, there's this idea that maybe it's not safe to use in goats, maybe it's not protective, so effective, or that it's not going to save them from some sort of like rabies control issue that would come up if there was a rabies exposure. So this is kind of a murky issue. So to dive into it, how vaccine licensing works for animals is licensing is controlled by the USDA, and the branch of the USDA that controls animal vaccine licensing is called the CVB, something Center for Veterinary Biologics or something. So to have a vaccine come onto the market that's licensed in any way, it has to pass through a CVB process. But what the USDA does to enter that process is it takes the clinical trials that the company ran for their vaccine that was in development, and it says, okay, if we can replicate what you found, we'll license it. But what they don't do is their own research studies. So for example, if a company is developing a rabies vaccine for livestock, and it does a bunch of clinical trials, and it does a trial on sheep, and it does a trial on goats, and it does a trial on horses. And for some reason, their trial on goats like didn't pan out, which could be for any number of unimportant reasons, right? I've done a lot of clinical trials, and the reasons, the like super trivial reasons why some trials just don't ever make it to publication can be really silly. And it has nothing to do with the safety of the product. But say this company had a great sheep trial and a great horse trial, and they heard that a different company might be coming out with a rabies vaccine, and they want to beat them through licensure and to market. They'll give the CVB their sheep trial and their horse trial, and CVB doesn't say, oh, maybe we'll do our own goat trial. They do not take that liability on. So they only, when they can replicate the sheep and the horse, only put that on the label. So therefore, the rabies vaccine was never licensed for goats. That doesn't mean that the clinical trials never happened though. So we do know that it's super safe. It's very effective. It's protective against rabies. It's just that no one, for some reason, was ever able to license it that way. Because with a lot of this stuff, it's a money problem. So if this company gets this product to market and they beat their competitor and the product gets out there and then it gets used for 25, 35 years with no problems, and they never saw a dip in sales because goats weren't on the label, then they don't have an incentive to go back and repeat $100,000 worth of clinical trials to try to get it labeled for that, and then go back through the expensive licensing process. There's no incentive for a company to do that if they're making great money from the product anyway. So that's the only reason why goats are not on the label. The reason why this causes a lot of people pause is that if a goat is vaccinated for rabies and gets bitten by an animal that ends up being verifiably rabid, right? So got bit by a raccoon, animal control got that raccoon tested, it's definitely rabid. Then there's an argument to be had about if that goat truly is protected from its vaccine or not. Whereas in other species, there is no argument. We know that it was protected from rabies. And so then the procedures that happen after that have a lot to do with, you know, confinement, quarantine, observation, whatever it's going to boil down to in that region, in that state. But since they're not licensed on the vaccine, it very much becomes subjective depending on who picks up the case and who's regulating it. Whereas in other species, it's not subjective. It's pretty clear. And that's where the vague area lies. So I can't predict what every animal control officer, every state veterinarian, every epidemiologist, public health is going to do about that situation. What I will say though is the times that I've spent in those areas of regulatory medicine, the goat that was vaccinated for rabies always kind of gets honored for their rabies protection. So in most situations, from what I've seen in my small sliver of the world, the regulatory agents are fine to grant that vaccine its due diligence in protecting that animal against rabies and proceed as if it was rabies vaccinated, officially licensed. However, I don't know. I don't know what every single animal control officer would do, or every state vet or whatever. So that is the issue with that. And again, it's one of those things where like, it's not a nice, quick 60-second soundbite answer, and it's a really boring explanation of licensing and money and research and crap. So it's hard to find, you know, the right explanation for this, but that is where the issue lies, and that's why there's a gray area. So the question of whether to vaccinate your goats for rabies or not really comes down to, you know, your own judgment call based on what you know about the licensing process and the vaccine itself, and how you feel this would proceed in your region if there was an actual rabies case. But I hope that helps answer the question. Can you technically use rabies vaccines in food production animals if it's not licensed that way? Yes. And I do encourage goat owners, especially if the owners are drinking raw milk from the goats, to vaccinate for rabies. Yeah. But yeah, that's about it on that. Any questions on rabies vaccines and goats? Anything at all? Oh, thank you, Tisbury Animal Control. Alrighty. Yeah, so I guess that's about it. We're at 8:15 now, so it's been about an hour and 15 minutes. But if anyone else has any wrap-up questions, oh, here's one. What age would you first vaccinate a baby goat for rabies along with their CDT timeline? That's an interesting question. So I would say around 3 or 4 months old is when the youngest I would vaccinate a goat for rabies, but that is not necessarily the same timeline I would recommend with CD&T. So for me, when to vaccinate a baby goat with CD&T depends on maternal vaccination status. So if that goat kid's mother was vaccinated with CD&T in the last trimester of her pregnancy with that goat kid, I personally think that you can hold off vaccinating for CD&T until 6 months of age is probably appropriate. But if that doe was not vaccinated in late trimester, I would vaccinate that goat kid earlier in life. You could, and after that, it's wide open. You could do a week old, you could do 1 month old, you could do 2 months old. It really depends on what your risk for tetanus is. I really try to hold off from vaccinating really young babies, so under a month old, unless there's some kind of like very present triggering risk, like I'm going to be banding or docking a tail or something like that. And if there is like a very imminent risk, the earliest I would do is 7 days old, so a week old. But yeah, it really depends on the situation. But for rabies, I would do 3 or 4 months old. And CD&T, if the doe was covered, I would do 6 months, 5 or 6 months. Yeah. No problem. Did you have any other questions? I know you kind of came in from a different time zone. You can feel free to unmute yourself too if you want.
Okay, is it unmuted? I'm just figuring all this out. Sorry.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm sorry I joined late between kids and
No, I get
other
it.
kids as well. My specific question was, we have myotonic goats. We have way too many chickens. And we had a case of a baby goat last month that was limping on his leg. And when we took him into our local livestock vet, he said, yeah, he's got a case of mycoplasma.
Okay.
And so he said he probably got it from the chickens, to which my daughter chimed in and said, yeah, we have a coughing chicken, to which my husband turned to her and said,
Don't say that.
what, when, what? So, that transpired into a whole thing. But
Yeah.
my question is, in particular with that, well, now we have 11 baby kids and our herd of goats, and we're kind of on the fence of, do we need to get rid of all these birds, or do we, plan of action, because obviously we have an issue.
So how was the mycoplasma in the goat identified? Was it just kind of presumptive?
I think so. I think,
Okay.
yes, I think he assumed probably from shared water, because
Okay.
the chickens decided to go where they want to go. That's what they do.
Okay. What state are you in?
Texas.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna look something up right now. So the type of mycoplasma that is going to be affecting the goats is probably different than the type of mycoplasma that would cause coughing in your chickens. Probably, most likely.
Oh,
They
okay.
tend to be species specific. So it's like Mycoplasma caprinae or something for the goats, and then it's Mycoplasma gallisepticum for the chickens. Usually, occasionally you have like one strain of Mycoplasma that will cross species, but they're almost always species specific.
Okay.
It's hard, very hard and very expensive to test for Mycoplasma in a goat, but it's very easy and very cheap to test for Mycoplasma in chickens. But what I'm looking up is if Mycoplasma gallisepticum is reportable in your state, because it is reportable in a lot of states. And that will tell you kind of how to figure that out.
Well, the vet did say, he said, hey, did you happen to buy any of your birds from such and such place over on the hill, blah, blah, blah. And my
Yeah.
husband said, yep. And he said, yeah, that guy has sick birds. That he's
Okay.
well known for that. So there's definitely a connection source that the vet's seen too, of like, hey, this
Yeah.
is, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I would say without that knowledge, you may as well test for it because it's pretty inexpensive. But with that knowledge, it sounds like a given that they might.
Right.
But I don't know if the goat's mycoplasma is necessarily related to the chicken's mycoplasma. So other question is, how old is your flock?
Gosh, we have some that are at least 2 years old, and some maybe all ranges from probably 3 years old to 1 years old.
Okay. Are they all from that place? Or are they
No,
different age
no.
groups from different places?
Probably 2-year-old birds are from that place, but
Okay.
yeah.
And do you think they're laying pretty well?
Yeah, that's the conundrum because they're laying, I mean, everything's just picked up tremendously with production right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I would not be thinking like you have to depopulate and get new birds. I would hang on to what you have. So the mycoplasma is definitely going to spread throughout the whole flock if it hasn't already. But the thing about mycoplasma is that the morbidity kind of comes and goes. It waxes and wanes. You can never make the mycoplasma go away. So you're not going to treat it to the point where it's cleared out of the flock. It's always going to be there. And for most of their life, they're not going to have a problem from it. Occasionally, if there's, something stressful going on, like a crazy, temperature swing or bad weather or avian influenza or something like that, then you'll kind of like see it manifesting a little bit more. And it'll manifest first as just like some sneezing and wheezing and coughing, really mild, self-resolving. Second, if it continues to escalate in a major drop in egg production, a lot of sinusitis, so really puffy facial swelling, and potentially a low mortality, but the mortality is not high. I mean, you might lose 5 to 10% of the flock from it if it gets really, really bad.
Okay.
But it's not really common for it to escalate like that.
Okay.
It's not super significant. So if you're not seeing it impact egg production to a point where your product or your commodity that you're selling is impacted, I honestly would not worry about it. Its prevalence is so common. And it's pretty easy to just kind of manage if you otherwise are keeping them pretty healthy. That, I mean, to do away with them and get new birds, it's like if it's not broke, don't fix it. You might end up with a worse problem than this one. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We were just wondering, do we need to start whatever makes sense for the overall health of everyone, every animal that is here, or whatever makes most sense. But that does make sense. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know if I have a worry of it being transmitted to the goats.
Hmm.
Mycoplasma in goats is also really common, so it's totally within reason to think you may coincidentally have both things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Do you have any other questions?
I don't know. Thank you though.
No problem. All right, so I did my best to record this, and I have no idea how to share it after this. But if I figure out how to share it, I will publicize and advertise the fact that I have figured out how to share it. Probably most likely what I would do is host it on my website. But I would just say if you want a recording of this, just hang tight and let me figure it out. And then at some point I'll circle back on the social medias and share the fact that I have it up. But thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, have a good night.